Guys, so in this video we're going to talk a little bit about paragraph development and incorporating your sources into your paper, right? Because that's where we're at right now. You should have a draft of your thesis statement and a rough outline of what you plan to include in the body of your paper. And then now you actually have to write it, right? So now we get to the part where you're taking all of these ideas, and it's okay if it feels a little chaotic and messy and kind of all over the place. I strongly recommend not trying to sit down and write the entire paper all at once, right? Break it down, do it in chunks. In this section at the bottom, I've included a couple of optional semi-inspirational resources. There are 2 chapters from a book called Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott. One of them, if you took English 101 with me last semester, you probably have already read. That's called Shitty First Drafts, right? And in it, Lamott talks a lot about kind of giving yourself permission to make that first draft as terrible and messy and awful as it needs to be, because the important part of that first draft is creating a draft, not creating a perfect final product, just getting your ideas onto the page. So that one's helpful if that's a place where you get stuck. She has some very practical advice around that. And the other one is called Short Assignments, and refers back to the title of the book, Bird by Bird, right? Just take it one thing at a time. Don't try to do everything all at once. And so that's why this week we're going to focus on paragraph development and source incorporation, because those are the pieces that you can kind of chunk out, right? So just take one of your subtopics from your outline and use it to practice this stuff with, and then just go from there. So in this video, first, we're going to talk about how to decide which method to use to incorporate your sources, right? You can use direct quotation, you can use paraphrase, summary, you could include an image. And so we're going to talk about how to decide which one to choose, which is the best possible way to include this information. No matter what you choose, you always want to make sure you're citing it. Plagiarism, as we all know, not good, something to be avoided. And you always want to make sure that you're explaining the context of that source, right? So incorporating it into your paper, not just kind of plunking it down. You never want to assume that your reader is going to interpret your information that you found in your research exactly the same way that you did. And one of the things that can happen when you're trying to write this kind of paper, and it's maybe new to you, maybe unfamiliar, is that it can feel like you're over-explaining. Go for it. Over-explain, over-clarify. Just make sure that there can be no confusion, no doubt about how these sources connect to your argument.
So there are some things to keep in mind when you're deciding how to incorporate your source information. There are a lot of different ways of including source information. You can use a direct quote, the source's exact language in quotation marks. You can paraphrase, use a specific idea, but in your own words. You can summarize, condense a big idea into a small space, and you can use graphics, although only occasionally, as you'll see in a minute. So using direct quotations is when you include the exact words from a source within quotation marks to indicate that it is exactly the same as the source that you are referencing. You want to do that when the source is perfect and original, the wording is just like exquisite, it's exactly what you want, or when you're refuting a specific idea or phrase from a source that you're using as a counter argument. And whenever you do that, you want to always be sure to introduce the source using relevant information. So that means sometimes the author's full name and credentials will be relevant, but sometimes they might not be. So you kind of have to use your judgment there. You only want to use what you need when you're using a direct quotation. So usually that's not going to be an entire paragraph of text. Instead, it might be a sentence or even just a fragment of a sentence. That's really the piece of evidence that you need to include. You want to always, never take things out of context and make sure that you're being true to the original purpose and context of the source. Always include an in-text citation after your quotation, and then explain your understanding of the quotation in the next sentence. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Using paraphrase is when you take a piece of information from your source, but instead of using a direct quote, you turn it into your own words. And so you would want to do this when the wording in the original is overly complicated or technical, and basically you can explain the idea better if you use your own words. When you're paraphrasing, there's some of the same things that you need to think about, but things that are a little bit different is that you really need to write your own sentence. You can't just change a few words and say, okay, I paraphrased. It needs to really be yours and not the phrasing or words of the original, because otherwise you're plagiarizing. And again, you never want to take anything out of context, include a citation, and explain the significance of the information in the next sentence. So summarizing is when you take a complete article or a book or a big idea and compress it down into just a few sentences in order to incorporate it more efficiently, right? So you want to do that when you have, you need to summarize like the big idea from a source or a study that was done that's important to your research. And then when you do that, you always want to make sure that you're explaining the main idea as it relates to your argument as briefly and clearly as possible. So when you're summarizing, really get it down to 1 to 3 sentences that accurately and briefly convey the information that you're trying to get across. You sometimes will need to include a citation for this, but usually you'll just want to reference the relevant information about the source right in the context of the summary, right? So in such and such article, so-and-so discovers that blah, 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 right? So you're summarizing the big picture ideas there. And then again, always connect it back to your argument. You can use graphics in your paper, but you definitely want to use them sparingly. So you really only want to use graphics in your paper when the image conveys something that you can't better include using paraphrase or summary, right? So you can't explain it with words, and you have to have the image there to convey the thing that you need to include in your paper. Or when the image itself is evidence that you're then going to go on and analyze as a part of your argument. And when you include graphics, a lot of this is the same too, right? So include relevant information when you introduce the image, keep the image in line with your paragraphs, make sure not to take it out of context, include a citation after the image, and then explain how that image connects to and supports your thesis. So in this next section, we're going to look at a sample body paragraph and sort of walk through the different sentences one at a time. So we're going to use this one, and I've included the thesis here because whenever you're looking at a body paragraph, every body paragraph is going to connect to and support your thesis. So we need to kind of know what that bigger picture argument is. So the thesis for this paper was, although many people argue that captivity is a place where orcas can flourish and thrive, marine parks cannot replicate life in the ocean. So first up, we have the topic sentence. The topic sentence is going to be the first sentence of every body paragraph, and it clearly states the topic of that paragraph and how that paragraph connects to and supports your thesis. Next up, we have some background or context before we get to the evidence and the source material. And then we introduce the quote. So Dr. Naomi Rose works the place where she works. So this is the relevant information that is going to help us contextualize the quote that's coming up next. And there we go. The quote is an exact quote. So quotation marks around the exact phrase from the source, followed by a citation, then followed by a sentence that explains the significance of the quote that we just read. Introduction and second quotation are one sentence, right? So you can do this too. So the sentence goes on to say Rose, because we introduced her before, so now we know who we're talking about. Rose goes on to explain how this impacts the lives of orcas by explaining that the offspring of the matriarch stay with her for their whole lives. Again, followed by that citation. You don't always need to say, if you're using a source twice in one paragraph, you don't always need to cite it twice. The goal in terms of not plagiarizing is making sure that it's clear. So as long as it's clear where that information came from, you're usually good. But erring on the side of caution is never a bad idea. Followed by, again, another explanation of the quote that we just read. So this is important because these orca families stay together, entire generations of social bonding and support. Now we have more source information from a second source, and this time it's paraphrased. So this is just the idea from that source that needed to be in here, but not necessarily the exact quotations about, matriarchs and socially bonded mammals. And again, an explanation of the quote, connecting it back to the bigger picture, making sure that you're connecting the dots for your reader. You really want them to just literally hold their hand through your entire argument. And then towards the end of the paragraph, you want a kind of concluding sentence that's going to clarify the relevance of everything that came before and how all of this fits into your thesis. And then often you can find a way to kind of transition to the next paragraph. So for example here, right, we might be heading into a paragraph next that talks about how captive orcas are sold or kept in separate tanks due to resource limitations, right? So that would be kind of a natural transition into the next paragraph. And there are a few big picture things to keep in mind as you draft too. We get ideas as we write, so it's okay if your thesis changes or if you discover you need to find a new source to cover some new aspect of your project. Consider paragraph balance. You want all of your paragraphs to weigh about the same amount, right? So that means they basically should be roughly the same length, somewhere between half a page and a full page, usually not much shorter or much longer. This is your paper, so most of what you include should be your ideas and thinking about what you found. When you submit it to Turnitin, there's about 20 to 25% should be your source material that you've incorporated. But the vast majority will be you and your voice and your ideas. Your sources might change, and that's okay. You don't have to go back and do a new annotated bibliography. You don't need to check with me. You can leave things out. You can add new things. Totally fine. And every project is different. So as you continue going through this process, remember that, your process might vary a little bit from everything that we've talked about here. And if you have questions, definitely always just email me or make an appointment and we can talk through whatever stage your project is at.